clock struck midnight, but the hands did not move. In the stillness of the old manor, a shadow lingered just beyond the candlelight. Lord Alistair's final breath echoed through the empty halls, his eyes wide with fear. The 13th hour was upon them, an hour beyond time, beyond reason, and with it, the dark secret of the Harrowfield family would finally be revealed. Who had killed him? And what truth lay hidden within the tick of that frozen clock? If you want to uncover the truth behind the 13th hour, don't let the mystery slip away. Like, share, and subscribe for more chilling tales. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think was behind the murder? And remember, the next mystery is just around the corner. Chapter 1. The clock strikes 13. The autumn evening had descended upon London like a heavy curtain, blanketing the city in cool silence. A light drizzle tapped rhythmically against the windows of 221B Baker Street, adding a sense of quiet mystery to the already tranquil atmosphere within. Inside, Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual armchair, the sharp angles of his face illuminated by the soft glow of the fireplace. His piercing eyes were fixed on the glowing embers, but his mind was already working through a puzzle, one that had yet to reveal itself. Dr. Watson, seated across from him, turned the pages of his medical journal with a quiet rustle. His thoughts were elsewhere, pondering the day's minor irritations, when the sudden, firm knock at the door broke the stillness. It was a sound that never failed to draw Holmes's attention, as if each knock on the door held the promise of a new mystery to unravel. "Come in," Holmes said, without taking his eyes from the fire. The door creaked open, and a tall, nervous figure stepped into the room. A man dressed in a dark coat, his face pale and strained, his eyes wide with anxiety. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, and his breath came in shallow, hurried gasps, as if he had been running for some time. "Mr. Holmes?" "Dr. Watson," the man stammered. "I beg your pardon for disturbing you at such an hour, but I am in desperate need of your help. There has been a murder. It happened at midnight, and the clock struck 13. Holmes's gaze sharpened instantly, and Watson looked up from his journal, his interest piqued by the man's words. "At midnight, you say?" Holmes's voice was calm, yet the glint in his eyes betrayed his intrigue. "That is hardly unusual, but the 13th hour, now that is an odd detail. And who, may I ask, is the victim?" The man took a step forward, wringing his hands. "Lord Alistair Harrowfield," he whispered, as if the name alone carried a heavy weight. "I am his butler, John Fairbanks. I found him dead in his study, stabbed in the back with a dagger. And yet, when I discovered the body, the clock on the mantelpiece had stopped at exactly the 13th hour. It was as if time itself had frozen." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes. "The 13th hour," Watson murmured, repeating the strange phrase. "How peculiar. A clock cannot strike 13. It is a simple mechanical impossibility." Holmes was already standing, his sharp mind moving with calculated precision. "That is indeed curious. A clock cannot strike 13, and yet it did, or so it appears. There is more to this than meets the eye. Mr. Fairbanks, please, explain what you know of the events leading up to this murder. We must understand every detail." Fairbanks swallowed hard, clearly rattled, but eager to divulge the facts. "I had served Lord Alistair for many years, sir. He was a man of great intellect, but in recent weeks, he became strange. He spoke often of time, of the 13th hour, and of a great reckoning that was to come. I thought it all nonsense, superstition, perhaps. But last night, he seemed more agitated than usual. He was muttering to himself about the clock, about fate, and about what was to happen when the clock struck 12. Holmes's interest deepened. Did you notice anything unusual about the hour itself? Any sounds? Any strange occurrences? Fairbanks shook his head. No, sir. I was in the kitchen at the time, preparing a late supper. But when I heard the clock strike midnight, I went to check on Lord Alistair, as I always did. That was when I found him, dead, by the desk. And the clock, it had stopped, frozen, at 13. Holmes's face remained impassive, but his mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. He knew that every word Fairbanks spoke was a thread in the intricate web of this case, and that each thread would lead to a truth hidden just beneath the surface. He turned to Watson, who was now standing by his side. Watson, we must go at once. There is much to discover. As they gathered their coats and prepared to leave, Holmes's thoughts were already racing ahead. What had Fairbanks meant by the 13th hour? What was its significance? And why had Lord Alistair been obsessed with time? There was something about the clock, something deeply symbolic, and it was no coincidence that it had stopped precisely at that moment. The streets of London were dark and quiet as they made their way to Harrowfield Manor. The air was thick with fog, and the gas lamps cast long, shadowy beams down the narrow streets. Holmes was deep in thought, his mind turning over every detail. As they approached the grand, imposing estate, the sense of foreboding grew. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, noting every detail, every movement in the shadows. There was something unnatural about this place, something that whispered of secrets buried beneath its walls. They entered the manor, where they were greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Haywood, who led them to the study. The room was dimly lit by a solitary candle, the shadows dancing eerily across the walls. The body of Lord Alistair lay slumped over his desk, a blood-stained dagger embedded in his back. His eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of surprise and terror. The room smelled faintly of incense, and the clock on the mantelpiece was indeed frozen at exactly 12 os. Holmes examined the room with his usual precision, his eyes darting from one detail to another. The room was undisturbed, except for the body. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture. It was as if Lord Alistair had been struck down in a moment of quiet contemplation. Then his gaze fell upon the clock. It was a large, ornate piece with intricate carvings and a brass pendulum. Holmes's fingers brushed gently over its surface, feeling for any hidden mechanisms. As he touched the back of the clock, he felt a faint indentation. Something was concealed there. He turned to Watson, his face unreadable. There is more to this than a simple murder. This clock, this 13th hour, it is the key. We must unravel its mystery, or the true killer will remain hidden in the shadows. As the investigation began, Holmes could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him. There was something deeply unsettling about this crime, something that connected time, fate, and the victim's obsession with the hour of his death. The 13th hour was not just a time, it was a symbol. And in the coming hours, Holmes would uncover the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface, where time itself had a deadly role to play. Chapter 2. The murder at Harrowfield. The night grew darker as Holmes, Watson, and Mr. Fairbanks made their way through the heavy wooden doors of Harrowfield Manor. The house, though grand, seemed to exude an unnatural stillness, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable truth to be uncovered. Holmes's eyes scanned the surroundings with a practiced air, noting every detail, every flicker of movement in the shadows. The manor, a sprawling estate perched on the outskirts of London, was draped in the quiet of night. The distant rustling of the wind in the trees and the muffled sounds of their footsteps echoed through the cold hallways. As they approached the study where Lord Alistair's body had been found, the atmosphere seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. Mrs. Haywood, the housekeeper, led them through the vast corridors. Her face was pale, drawn tight with worry. "The study is this way, sirs," she murmured, her voice hushed as if the very walls of the house were listening. "I must warn you, it is a sight you will not soon forget." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable, but his mind was already working through 1,000 scenarios. As they entered the study, the scene was even more chilling than they had imagined. Lord Alistair's body lay slumped over his desk, a dagger plunged deep into his back. The blood had already congealed into dark pools on the carpet, and the faint smell of iron hung in the air. His once pristine clothing was now marred by the stain of death. The expression on his face was one of shock, his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. It was as if he had never seen it coming. The room was eerily still, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. The shadows seemed to stretch longer in the corners of the room, dancing with the flickering light. Holmes's gaze moved slowly across the scene, taking in the position of the body. The untouched papers scattered on the desk, the faint traces of incense in the air, a subtle, almost ethereal scent that seemed to cling to the room like a secret. Watson stepped forward, examining the body with his usual attention to detail. "There are no signs of struggle, Holmes," he said, his voice calm but edged with concern. "It appears Lord Alistair didn't even try to defend himself. Whoever did this must have been someone he trusted." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he examined the scene. He stepped closer to the desk, his fingers gently brushing over the papers that were scattered across it. Most of them were business letters, some personal correspondence, but one particular sheet of paper caught his attention. It was a letter, written in a hurried hand, the ink slightly smudged, as though it had been written just before the tragic event. Holmes picked it up, his mind already piecing together the details. The letter read, "The 13th hour draws near. When it strikes, all debts will be paid. Do not fear the clock. It is only the beginning." Watson looked over Holmes's shoulder as he read. "A cryptic message, Holmes. What do you make of it?" Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile, the only hint of emotion on his otherwise impassive face. "It seems our victim was obsessed with the idea of time, specifically the 13th hour. But this message is more than a mere obsession. It speaks of a reckoning, of debts being paid. Lord Alistair may have known that his death was imminent, Watson, and perhaps he was ready for it. But there was something else, something Holmes could not yet put his finger on. The clock, the 13th hour. It was as if time itself had played a role in this murder, as if the very concept of time had become entangled in the victim's fate. Holmes turned toward Fairbanks, who had remained silent, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. "Tell me, Mr. Fairbanks," Holmes said, his voice calm but firm. "What did your master mean by the 13th hour? Did he speak of it often?" Fairbanks swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Yes, sir. In the weeks leading up to his death, Lord Alistair was changed. He became fixated on time, especially that hour. He would often speak about the clock, about a great reckoning that would come at midnight. But he also mentioned the 13th hour, an hour beyond midnight. He believed that at that time, something would be revealed, something beyond his control." Watson's brow furrowed. "The 13th hour, beyond midnight? How can that be?" Holmes turned toward Watson, his eyes sharp. "It cannot be, Watson. It is a symbol, a belief, a superstition. But in this case, it is no mere fancy. Someone or something has manipulated time itself to create a twisted, fatal narrative." The more Holmes thought about the letter, the more he was convinced that it held the key to the murder. It was clear that Lord Alistair had been involved in something far more dangerous than a simple obsession with time. The message spoke of debts to be paid, of something coming when the clock struck the 13th hour. But what exactly was this debt? And who was responsible for delivering it? Holmes's mind raced, connecting the dots. The clock in the study had stopped at midnight, a mechanical impossibility. Lord Alistair had been waiting for something, someone to arrive at that precise moment. But who or what had struck the fatal blow? And why had the clock stopped at the 13th hour? Holmes moved to the mantelpiece, where the clock stood. The hands were frozen in place, pointing to the hour of midnight. But there was no mechanical reason for the clock to stop. It wasn't broken. It wasn't faulty. It had simply been stopped, deliberately. As Holmes inspected the clock, he noticed a faint scratch on its back. His fingers traced it gently, and to his surprise, the back of the clock popped open, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a delicate, old-fashioned key. It was a key unlike any other Holmes had seen before, its design intricate and mysterious, almost as if it held the answer to a riddle. "Ah," Holmes murmured, "this changes everything. It seems our mystery has many layers, Watson. We have uncovered a hidden truth, one that leads us deeper into the heart of this case." Holmes turned to the others, his mind already calculating the next step. "I believe it is time to speak with the others in the house. We must understand the full picture before this case unravels further." Mrs. Haywood, who had been watching silently from the doorway, nodded in agreement. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I will gather the others at once." As they prepared to delve deeper into the mystery, the tension in the room thickened. The clock, the 13th hour, and the cryptic message were only the beginning. Something far darker was at play here, and Holmes could feel it. A storm of secrets waiting to break. Chapter 3. The Silent Witness. The moon hung high over Harrowfield Manor, casting an eerie silver glow across the estate. The wind had quieted, and only the faint rustling of the trees outside could be heard as Holmes, Watson, and Mr. Fairbanks made their way back through the dimly lit corridors of the manor. The house seemed to be holding its breath, its very walls absorbing the weight of the mystery unfolding within. Holmes's mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of evidence they had discovered in Lord Alistair's study. The letter, the cryptic message, the frozen clock, all of it pointed towards something far deeper than a simple murder. The 13th hour, a concept seemingly pulled from the realm of superstition, had taken on a dark and tangible meaning. But what did it signify? Who was behind Lord Alistair's death, and why had they gone to such lengths to weave time itself into the narrative? As they made their way to the drawing room, Mrs. Haywood, the housekeeper, led them through the maze of corridors. She had not spoken much since their last conversation, but her presence was a quiet, unnerving reminder of the gravity of the situation. Holmes observed her closely, his sharp eyes noting every subtle movement, every change in her demeanor. There was more to this woman than met the eye, and Holmes was determined to uncover it. In the drawing room, they found the other residents of the house waiting: Lady Eleanor, Lord Alistair's wife, and Reginald, his nephew. Both appeared to be on edge, their faces drawn tight with worry, as if they had been anticipating the arrival of the detectives, but were dreading what they might uncover. Lady Eleanor, her elegant features shadowed by grief, stood by the window, gazing out into the night. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and her eyes, though tear-streaked, remained steadfast and composed. Reginald, on the other hand, was pacing back and forth, his brow furrowed, his hands buried deep in his pockets. There was an air of nervous tension about him, a sense that he was wrestling with something, perhaps with his own guilt, or perhaps with fear. Holmes's gaze flickered briefly between them before he spoke. "I believe it is time we speak with each of you, one at a time. There is much to understand, and I require your full cooperation." Lady Eleanor turned slowly, her gaze meeting Holmes's. "What do you need from us, Mr. Holmes?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of sorrow, yet underlined with a quiet resolve. "My husband is gone, and we are left with nothing but this madness. What more is there to discover?" Holmes studied her for a moment before replying, "I am sorry for your loss, Lady Eleanor, but it is precisely the circumstances of your husband's death that we must unravel. The 13th hour is a clue, and it leads us to many questions. I must ask, did your husband speak of it often? Was he obsessed with time?" Lady Eleanor's gaze faltered for a moment, and she looked away, her lips tightening. "He did speak of time," she admitted. "In the last few weeks, he became increasingly withdrawn. He mentioned the 13th hour more than once. It seemed to haunt him. He was convinced that something would happen at midnight, that there was a reckoning. But it was more than that. He feared it, and yet he also believed that it was inevitable." Watson stepped forward, his voice gentle. "So, you believe your husband was frightened of something? But did he ever say what this reckoning was?" Lady Eleanor hesitated, as though the answer might be too painful to voice. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He never said outright, but I think he knew his time was running out. He said that time itself would come to collect the debt, and that we would all have to face it. He was preparing for something, though he never told me what." Holmes's mind raced. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Lord Alistair had known something. Perhaps he had even anticipated his own death. But what had he meant by debt? And who or what had he feared? Turning away from Lady Eleanor, Holmes's attention shifted to Reginald. The young man's nervous energy was palpable. His eyes darted from Holmes to Watson and back again, as if he were trying to decide whether to speak or remain silent. Holmes fixed him with a sharp gaze. "Reginald," he said, his tone deliberate. "I must ask you the same question. Your uncle was clearly troubled in his final days. Did he confide in you about his fears? Did he mention anything about the 13th hour or the reckoning he believed was coming?" Reginald stopped pacing and looked down at the floor, his fists clenched. After a long moment, he lifted his head, meeting Holmes's gaze with a mixture of defiance and guilt. "I didn't believe it, Mr. Holmes. I thought it was all nonsense. But he did talk about it, especially the clock. He was obsessed with it. I didn't understand it then, but now I see it differently. He kept saying that time was running out for him, that he was bound to meet the reckoning sooner or later. And he mentioned someone, a shadow, who would come for him when the clock struck midnight." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A shadow? What did he mean by that?" Reginald looked uneasy, his eyes flickering with something unspoken. "He said that someone would come at midnight. But it wasn't a person. It was something beyond that. A force. A reckoning that could not be avoided. He said it would all come to an end when the clock struck 12. But that wasn't the worst part." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Reginald's every word. "What was the worst part, Reginald?" Reginald's voice dropped to a near whisper. "He said it wasn't over when the clock struck 12. There would be a 13th hour, a time beyond time, and that's when it would be finished. That's when everything would end." A chill ran down Watson's spine, and Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The 13th hour," he murmured. "It was not just a superstition. It was a prophecy. Lord Alistair knew it, and he believed it would come to pass." Watson glanced at Holmes, sensing the mounting tension in the room. "But why did your uncle speak of this shadow, Reginald? Was it someone he feared? A person, perhaps?" Reginald shook his head. "I don't know, Dr. Watson. He never mentioned a name. But I have a feeling." He stopped, his eyes darting to the door, as if expecting someone to appear. Holmes's voice was calm, but the underlying tension in it was unmistakable. "You are hiding something, Reginald. There is more to this than you are telling us. What are you afraid of?" The room fell silent. Reginald's face paled, and for a moment, it seemed as if the very air in the room had thickened. The weight of the unspoken truth hung heavy, and Holmes knew that this was only the beginning of unraveling a far deeper mystery. As the minutes passed, it became clear that the truth behind Lord Alistair's death was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The 13th hour, a time that defied all logic and reason, had been the key to understanding Lord Alistair's final days, and perhaps even to solving his murder. Holmes looked at Watson, a spark of realization in his eyes. "We have only just begun, my friend. There is more to uncover, and I have no doubt that the shadow Reginald spoke of is closer than we think." Chapter 4. The 13th Hour. Revealed. The chill in the air seemed to grow heavier as Holmes, Watson, and their reluctant companion, Mr. Fairbanks, made their way from the drawing room to the very heart of Harrowfield Manor, the study where Lord Alistair had met his untimely end. The manor, though magnificent, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets and shadows. Each corner seemed to whisper of untold stories, of lives intertwined by fate, and of a darkness lurking just beneath the surface. Holmes, ever the observer, noted the subtle change in atmosphere. There was something almost alive about the house, something that seemed to breathe with an unseen force. It was as though the manor itself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the truth to be revealed. and for the pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. As they entered the study once more, the scene remained much the same as when they had first discovered it. The lifeless body of Lord Alistair slumped at his desk, the daggers still lodged in his back, the blood having long since dried. The clock on the mantelpiece remained frozen at midnight, its hands mocking the passage of time. The room felt colder, more oppressive, as if the very air was thick with the weight of the unanswered questions. Holmes stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the room with their usual sharpness. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that the victim had been caught off guard. Everything seemed eerily still, as though time itself had paused in the moment of Lord Alistair's death. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice steady, but with a hint of excitement that only he could truly mask. "We are looking at a case far more intricate than we first imagined. The 13th hour is not simply a symbolic notion. It is a key to something deeper, something that transcends this moment in time." Watson's eyes flickered with curiosity. "But what does it mean, Holmes? We know it is connected to Lord Alistair's obsession with time, and we know that someone killed him in the very room where he awaited his fate. But why the clock? Why the 13th hour?" Holmes stepped closer to the mantelpiece, his fingers hovering over the clock once more. He seemed to be speaking to himself, his mind working in rapid succession, piecing together the scattered fragments of the puzzle. "The clock itself is no mere timepiece, Watson. It is part of the message, part of the ritual. Lord Alistair believed in this hour beyond midnight, this mysterious 13th hour. But what he failed to understand is that time, like everything else, can be manipulated. And someone has used this belief to their advantage." His words hung in the air, dense with meaning, but it was still unclear what the advantage was. Why had Lord Alistair's obsession with time led to his death? And who had manipulated him? Or had he, in his final moments, been a pawn in a far larger game? Holmes turned to Fairbanks, who had been standing silently by the door. "Mr. Fairbanks, you mentioned earlier that Lord Alistair feared someone would come at midnight. But did he ever speak of who this shadow was, or what it wanted?" Fairbanks shifted uncomfortably, as if struggling to find the right words. "No, sir. He never named a person, but he spoke often of debts, of paying them. He said it wasn't just about the clock. It was about what happens when the clock strikes 12. And when the 13th hour comes, that's when everything ends. He seemed to believe that the debt could only be paid at that moment, when time itself had run its course." Holmes's gaze darkened as he absorbed Fairbanks's words. "A debt," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "This is not just a murder. This is an act of retribution. Someone or something has orchestrated this reckoning. But who? And what is the nature of the debt?" His fingers lightly traced the face of the clock once more, and this time he noticed something faint, hidden in plain sight. On the edge of the clock's brass frame was a small engraving, almost imperceptible unless one looked very closely. It was a name, R.V., inscribed in delicate script. Holmes's eyes widened. "Reginald," Holmes murmured, the name rolling off his tongue with a new understanding. Watson turned toward him, his face full of question. "What do you mean, Holmes?" Holmes turned sharply, his expression intense. "Reginald, the nephew. It seems this debt is one that runs deep within the family. Lord Alistair's obsession with time was not simply his own, He believed it was tied to something far larger, something within his bloodline. RV could stand for Reginald Vance, his nephew. The letters are too deliberate to be a coincidence. Fairbanks stiffened. What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes? That young Reginald had something to do with his uncle's death? Holmes gave him a piercing look. Not yet. But the name is no mere accident. We must investigate this further. The clock is part of the mystery, and its message points to more than just a premonition. Reginald could be the key to understanding Lord Alistair's final moments. Holmes turned back to the clock and carefully opened the back panel. Inside, he found an intricate series of gears and springs, but there was also something else. A small, hidden compartment that hadn't been noticed before. With delicate fingers, he pried it open, revealing an old, yellowed letter tucked inside. Holmes unfolded the letter and scanned its contents. It was a letter from a lawyer, dated nearly 20 years ago, addressed to Lord Alistair. The contents were written in a formal, almost cold tone, detailing the inheritance of the Harrowfield estate and the stipulations that came with it. It mentioned something that stood out. A clause stating that the estate would only be passed on to the rightful heir if a certain condition was met. Something to do with the passing of time and a specific hour. The letter concluded with a chilling line. At the stroke of the 13th hour, the rightful heir will take his place. Time will reveal the true heir, as it always has. Holmes's mind raced as he read the words. This condition, it was always about more than just succession. It was about time itself. The 13th hour was tied to the inheritance. Lord Alistair was not simply concerned about his death. He was concerned about who would inherit the estate when the clock struck 12. But it seems that his own obsession with time led him to forget the most important thing of all, the debt that needed to be repaid. Watson's eyes widened with realization. The debt? It was not just a metaphor for something spiritual. It was about ownership, about legacy, about power. Whoever had the right to the estate after Lord Alistair's death could be the one who benefited most from the 13th hour. Holmes turned to Fairbanks once more. Mr. Fairbanks, did Lord Alistair ever express concern about his nephew Reginald inheriting the estate? Was there any mention of a dispute over who would inherit? Fairbanks looked away, his face pale. Yes, sir. Lord Alistair feared Reginald. He feared that his nephew would take what was rightfully his. He mentioned a curse tied to the bloodline. He believed that whoever inherited the estate would be bound to a debt that could never truly be repaid. Holmes's face darkened as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The debt was not just financial, it was spiritual, tied to the legacy of the Harrowfield family. Lord Alistair knew that someone would come to claim the estate, and that the reckoning, the 13th hour, was the moment when all debts would finally be settled. Watson looked at Holmes in stunned silence, realizing that the case had taken a much darker turn than they had anticipated. Chapter 5. The Final Hour. The night air grew colder still as Holmes, Watson, and Mr. Fairbanks continued their investigation through the grand but haunting halls of Harrowfield Manor. The weight of the mystery seemed to cling to every surface, the very walls echoing with the whispers of long-buried secrets. The estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood as a silent witness to the tragic events that had unfolded within its walls. Holmes's mind was sharp as ever. But the truth was becoming increasingly elusive. Each new discovery seemed to add another layer to the puzzle, but it also raised more questions. The 13th hour, the concept that had haunted Lord Alistair in his final days, had now become the key to unraveling the entire mystery. But what did it truly mean? And how was it tied to the fate of the Harrowfield estate? As they made their way back to the study, Holmes's thoughts raced. He had pieced together much, but the final thread, Reginald's involvement, was still shrouded in uncertainty. The family's legacy, bound by time and debt, seemed to hold the answer, yet it was clear that the 13th hour had more significance than simply marking the moment of Lord Alistair's death. Mrs. Haywood, the housekeeper, had quietly informed them that Reginald had retired to his room for the night, clearly overwhelmed by the events of the day. Holmes, with his keen sense of timing, knew that now was the moment to confront the young heir, to reveal the final truths, and to solve the mystery that had begun with a clock's fatal strike. The study was just as they had left it, but there was something new in the air, something palpable, almost electric. Holmes stood before the desk, his eyes scanning the room one last time. The body had been removed, the evidence catalogued, but the mystery lingered in every corner. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice steady, "I believe we are very close now. The answers are within our grasp, but there is one last piece to place. We must speak with Reginald. It is time." Watson nodded, his face thoughtful. "But what do you think happened, Holmes? Is Reginald the killer? Was he behind the murder?" Holmes's gaze was intense as he turned to face Watson. "Not yet, Watson. But I believe Reginald knows more than he has let on. His connection to the 13th hour, to the inheritance, is not just coincidental. There is something deeper here, something tied to the family's legacy. And we have to understand what that is before we can truly understand Lord Alistair's death." The two men made their way to Reginald's chambers, where they found the young man seated in a chair by the window, staring out into the darkened grounds. The moonlight bathed the room in a soft, otherworldly glow, casting long shadows on the walls. Reginald looked up as they entered, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and grief. Holmes approached him slowly, his gaze never leaving the young man's face. "Reginald, we must speak," he said, his voice calm yet authoritative. "It is time to confront the truth." Reginald stood up, his face a mixture of fear and defiance. "What more is there to say, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, his voice trembling. "My uncle is dead, and it is my fault. I couldn't stop it." Watson took a step forward. "What do you mean, Reginald? You didn't kill your uncle, did you?" Reginald shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "No, not with my own hands. No, but I might as well have. My uncle's death was inevitable, and I knew it. I knew the moment I entered this house that time had already decided my fate." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Time, Reginald? What do you mean by that?" The young man turned away, his hands gripping the back of the chair as if for support. "I thought it was just a family legend, a story told to frighten the younger generation. But when I saw the clock stop at midnight, when I saw my uncle's fear, I knew it was real. The 13th hour isn't just a superstition, it's the reckoning, the moment when everything comes full circle." Watson's voice was gentle as he asked, "But why, Reginald? Why would Lord Alistair believe in such a thing? Why would he allow himself to be consumed by it?" Reginald's eyes were haunted as he spoke. My uncle believed that time wasn't just a measure of the passing hours. He believed it was alive, that it could shape our destinies, and that the Harrowfield bloodline was bound by it. The 13th hour, it was more than just a concept. It was a contract, a debt, one that could only be paid when the clock struck its final toll. Holmes's gaze never wavered. A debt? A contract? And who was this debt owed to? Reginald fell silent for a long moment. To the family, to the bloodline. You see, Mr. Holmes, my uncle and I were both tied to it. We were both bound by it, bound by the inheritance. But it was never meant for me. My uncle had made a deal long ago, a deal that would ensure the Harrowfield estate would pass to him and not to anyone else. Holmes stepped closer, his expression unreadable. And you, Reginald? What did you know of this deal? Reginald turned to face him, his eyes dark with guilt and fear. I knew enough to understand that I would never be free of it, that I would always be bound to the clock, to the debt that had been accumulated by generations of Harrowfields before me. My uncle was never supposed to die at midnight, but I think he knew that when the 13th hour came, he would be replaced. His time had run out, and I was to take his place. But he couldn't bear it. He feared it, just as much as I did. A long pause filled the room, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, Holmes spoke again, his voice soft but resolute. So you believe that your uncle's death was part of the family's curse? That it was inevitable, tied to the passing of time in the bloodline? Reginald nodded slowly. Yes, I do. And when I found him that night, when I saw the clock had stopped at the 13th hour, I knew that it was the end. I knew that time had taken its toll and that there was no escaping it. Holmes's gaze softened ever so, slightly. Reginald, you are not to blame for your uncle's death. The 13th hour is not a curse. It is a symbol, one that has been used to control and manipulate you. But you must understand, time is not a force to be feared. It is a tool, one that can be used to shape the future, not to trap it. Reginald sank back into the chair, tears welling in his eyes. But the estate, the legacy, it's all tied to it. I didn't ask for this. I never wanted this. Holmes nodded. I know. But now, the most important thing is to understand the truth. Your uncle's death was not a result of fate or the clock. It was a result of the choices that were made long ago. You are not bound to that past, Reginald. You have a future ahead of you, one free from the debts and curses of your ancestors. The room fell into a deep, contemplative silence. Reginald sat in the chair, his head bowed, as if the weight of his family's legacy had finally lifted. The final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. The 13th hour was not a moment of retribution, but a symbol of change. A change that had come with Lord Alistair's death, and one that Reginald, for better or worse, was now tasked with embracing. As Holmes and Watson turned to leave, the young man's voice stopped them. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, Reginald said quietly, for showing me the truth. Holmes turned to face him one last time, his expression softened. You have a long road ahead of you, Reginald, but it is your road to walk. Do not let the past control you any longer. As they left Harrowfield Manor, the weight of the case began to lift, the final pieces of the mystery now in place. The 13th hour had come and gone, but its significance had been revealed, not as a curse, but as a turning point. Chapter 6, Justice at Midnight. The night had settled into an almost unnatural quiet, as if the very world was waiting for something to unfold. The full moon hung high above Harrowfield Manor, casting a cold, silvery light over the estate, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the grounds like dark fingers reaching out into the abyss. Inside the manor, however, there was a new sense of calm, a calm that had come after the storm of discovery. Holmes, Watson, and Mr. Fairbanks sat in the drawing room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, its warmth contrasting with the chill that lingered outside. Reginald had been left alone to contemplate the revelations that had come to light in the past few hours. He had no more secrets to hide, no more shadows to keep at bay. The truth, though painful, had been revealed, and now only one question remained. What would he do with the knowledge that the 13th hour, the family legacy, and the debts of the past were all part of a carefully crafted narrative that had led to his uncle's death? Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face as he observed the flickering flames. "It is nearly over, Watson," he said softly, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of anticipation. "The final piece of the puzzle is now in place, but there is still one last matter to address." Watson, who had been lost in his thoughts, looked up, his expression thoughtful. "You mean Reginald's future, Holmes? The estate? What will happen to it now that the truth is out?" Holmes's gaze sharpened as he met Watson's eyes. "Exactly. The inheritance, the legacy of the Harrowfield family. Reginald now stands at a crossroads. He must decide whether to continue the cycle of fear and debt that has haunted this family for generations, or whether to break free and make a new path for himself." The fire crackled again, its warm light casting dancing shadows on the walls, but it could not dispel the unease that lingered in the room. Holmes's mind, always calculating, was already ahead, anticipating the inevitable conclusion of the case. And yet, despite the clarity of his reasoning, something told him that the final moments of this mystery would not come easily. Just as the clock struck midnight, a soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Holmes, ever alert, stood and opened it to find a pale and shaken Reginald standing in the doorway. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face drawn with the weight of the past, but there was a new sense of resolve in his posture. "Mr. Holmes," Reginald said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I have come to make my decision. I cannot run from the past any longer. I must face what my family has done, and what it has cost us all." Holmes nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Come in, Reginald. We have much to discuss." Reginald stepped into the room, and for a moment the air felt thick with the unspoken tension. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and the silence between them seemed to stretch for an eternity. But Holmes, ever the master of calm, allowed the moment to linger, giving Reginald the time he needed to gather his thoughts. "I know what I must do," Reginald continued, his voice softer now, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "The 13th hour. It was never meant to be a curse. It was a turning point, a chance to break free from the chains of the past. My uncle, he lived his life in fear of it, but he could not escape it. And I have realized that I don't have to be bound by it either." Holmes regarded him with a mixture of respect and understanding. "That is the first step, Reginald. Understanding that the past does not define you. You are not beholden to the mistakes of those who came before you." Reginald nodded, his eyes clearing as the weight of his family's legacy began to lift. I've made arrangements to sell the estate, to donate the funds to causes that will truly make a difference. I don't want the power or the curse of the Harrowfield name anymore. I want to make something of myself, something that is my own, not tied to the debts of the past. Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet approval. You are choosing a different path, one that does not rely on the fear of time or legacy. It is a difficult decision, Reginald, but it is the right one. Watson, who had been listening intently, spoke up. It seems that the death of your uncle, though tragic, has led to something positive after all. The cycle of fear and obligation ends with you. Reginald smiled faintly, a mix of sadness and relief in his expression. Yes, I believe it does. For a moment, the three men sat in silence, the fire crackling softly in the background, each lost in their own thoughts. The tension in the room had dissipated, replaced by a quiet understanding. The case was no longer about uncovering a murder. It was about breaking free from the past and choosing a new future. But as the clock ticked on, Holmes's mind turned once more to the details of the case. There were still questions left unanswered, small threads that had yet to be fully tied together. And as the final moments of the mystery loomed, he knew that the truth of Lord Alistair's death was still shrouded in one final piece of the puzzle. Reginald, Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence, there's one last matter to address. The killer. Reginald's face tightened, his expression shifting from relief to confusion. The killer? But I thought it was understood. My uncle's death was part of the family's legacy, tied to the 13th hour, wasn't it? Holmes shook his head, his eyes dark with certainty. No, Reginald. What you believe about your uncle's death is only part of the story. The true killer is someone who understood the symbolism of the 13th hour and manipulated it to their advantage. Someone who wanted the estate, who wanted to control it after your uncle's death. Someone who played the game of legacy and time to their benefit. Reginald's eyes widened with realization. You mean someone in the house? Holmes nodded. Precisely. And that someone is not you, Reginald. You are not the murderer. The true killer is someone who used the family's obsession with time to cover their tracks. Someone who is still in this house. Reginald's breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the door, his gaze darting around the room. Who could it be? Holmes stood, his face grim. We shall find out. But for now, let us move swiftly. The truth is always lurking in the most unexpected places. As Holmes, Watson, and Reginald made their way out into the corridor, the air seemed to grow even colder. They were on the verge of something far darker than they had anticipated, something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The final hour was approaching, and with it, the last revelation. The 13th hour, after all, had its own secrets, and now it was time to uncover them. Chapter 7. The last reveal. The atmosphere in Harrowfield Manor was thick with anticipation as Holmes, Watson, and Reginald moved swiftly through the darkened corridors, their footsteps echoing through the silent halls. The manor, once so full of life and grandeur, now seemed like a mausoleum, a place where the past and present were interwoven, and the very air seemed to pulse with secrets long buried. Holmes's mind was sharp, as always, but now there was a sense of urgency to his thoughts. The pieces of the puzzle had almost all fallen into place, but there was still one last lingering question. Who had killed Lord Alistair, and why? The clues had pointed to many possibilities, but now, at the 11th hour, the final answer was within reach. As they reached the drawing room, Holmes motioned for the others to remain quiet. His keen eyes flicked over the room, noting every detail, every movement, every shadow. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light across the room, but it did little to dispel the unease that hung in the air. Holmes's instincts were on edge. He knew the killer was close, and the truth was about to be revealed. "Mr. Fairbanks," Holmes called, his voice cutting through the silence. "Please join us. It is time we bring this matter to its final conclusion." Fairbanks, who had been waiting in the shadows, stepped forward, his face pale but composed. He had been an integral part of the investigation from the beginning, but now, in this moment, Holmes was certain that he held the key to solving the murder. Reginald, his face still drawn with the weight of recent revelations, looked between the two men. "What is it, Mr. Holmes? What have we missed?" Holmes's gaze remained fixed on Fairbanks as he replied, his voice steady but firm. "It is time, Mr. Fairbanks, to reveal your role in all of this." Fairbanks stiffened, his eyes flickering with something dark, something that had been hidden until now. "My role?" he repeated, his voice tight. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes stepped closer, his sharp eyes never leaving Fairbanks's face. "You, Mr. Fairbanks, have been playing a game of manipulation and deceit. The 13th hour, the obsession with time, and the family's legacy, they were all part of your plan, weren't they?" For the first time, Fairbanks's mask of composure cracked. His lips trembled, and a flash of panic flickered in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence was thick, suffocating, and Holmes pressed on. "You knew about the clause in Lord Alistair's will, didn't you?" Holmes continued, his voice cold and precise. "You knew that whoever controlled the estate after his death would be bound by the 13th hour, that they would inherit not just the wealth, but the debt that had been accumulated by generations of the Harrowfield family. And you were willing to do anything to take that power, weren't you?" Fairbanks's shoulders sagged, the weight of his guilt finally catching up with him. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, it's true. I was the one who set everything in motion. I knew about the clause, about the 13th hour. I knew that Lord Alistair's obsession with time would be his undoing, and I used that against him." Reginald took a step back, his face a mixture of disbelief and horror. You killed him? You used the clock, the 13th hour, to murder my uncle?" Fairbanks nodded, his eyes avoiding Reginald's gaze. "It was the only way, Reginald. Your uncle's obsession with time, with the legacy of the Harrowfield family, it consumed him. He would never have given up the estate willingly. But I knew that if I could manipulate the clock, stop it at midnight, and make it seem like the 13th hour had arrived, I could create the illusion of fate. I could make it look like your uncle had been claimed by his own belief in time." Watson, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with disbelief. "But why, Mr. Fairbanks? Why would you go to such lengths? What did you stand to gain?" Fairbanks's eyes were filled with a cold, calculating rage. "Everything, Watson. The estate, the wealth, the power. It all came to me. I knew that once Lord Alistair was gone, I would be the one to inherit. The legacy, the debts, They would be mine to control, and I would use it to secure my future. But your uncle's foolishness, his obsession with time, it was his downfall. Holmes's expression remained unchanged as he absorbed Fairbanks's confession. The pieces of the puzzle had come together at last, and the truth was as dark as he had suspected. Fairbanks had used the very thing that had haunted Lord Alistair, the 13th hour, to orchestrate his murder, to claim what he believed was rightfully his. But there was more. There was always more. Mr. Fairbanks, Holmes said, his voice low but filled with a quiet intensity, you have confessed to the murder of Lord Alistair, but the truth does not end here. You were not alone in this. There was someone else who helped you, someone who benefited from your actions. Fairbanks's eyes widened, his expression betraying a flicker of fear. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Holmes. I acted alone. There was no one else. Holmes shook his head, a faint smile playing at the edges of his lips. No, Mr. Fairbanks. You were not the only one with a vested interest in the outcome of this affair. Reginald, your nephew, had his own reasons for wanting his uncle gone. You didn't think that he would just walk away with nothing, did you? Reginald's face drained of color as he turned toward Holmes, his voice trembling with disbelief. No, that's not possible. I never wanted this. I didn't want any of it. Holmes turned toward Reginald, his expression softening. You may not have wanted it, Reginald, but you were complicit. You knew what was happening in your own house. You saw the obsession, the manipulation, and you did nothing to stop it. The debts of your family were not just financial. They were moral, spiritual, and now they have come due. Reginald stood frozen, unable to speak, his gaze fixed on Fairbanks, who was now visibly shaking. Holmes stepped forward, his voice firm. The debt is paid now, Mr. Fairbanks. Your manipulation, your greed, has led to this moment. And while Reginald's role in this affair is not as clear-cut as yours, he must still face the consequences of his inaction. The room fell into a tense silence as the final pieces of the mystery settled into place. The killer was unmasked, the family's dark legacy exposed, and the truth had finally come to light. But as Holmes turned to leave, he knew that the road ahead would not be easy for Reginald. He had made his choice, but the burden of the past would always be with him. The clock in the drawing room ticked softly, the sound marking the passage of time, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For the first time in what felt like forever, the Harrowfield family would be free of the debts and shadows of the past. The 13th hour had come and gone, but the future was theirs to shape. Chapter 8, A New Dawn. The night after the revelation hung thick with the weight of finality. The once grand Harrowfield Manor, a place that had been a sanctuary of secrets and family legacies, now stood as a testament to the dark forces that had shaped it. With Lord Alistair's death, the 13th hour was no longer just a distant foreboding tale. It had become a reality, a truth that had led to murder, betrayal, and a reckoning far greater than anyone had anticipated. Holmes, Watson, and Reginald stood in the dimly lit drawing room, the fire now only a faint glow in the hearth, its warmth unable to dispel the chill that had settled into Reginald's bones. The confession of Mr. Fairbanks, the manipulations of time and legacy, and the inevitable truths had all come to light. But now, at the precipice of the dawn, there was only silence. Reginald, who had been standing near the window, gazing out at the estate, turned slowly to face Holmes, His eyes, though clearer than before, still held the weight of centuries of family history, a history tainted with obsession, greed, and now, murder. "I've done it, Holmes," Reginald said softly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "I've taken the step. I've signed the papers to sell the estate. It will be gone by tomorrow." Holmes nodded, his gaze steady as he met Reginald's eyes. "You have chosen the right path, Reginald. The legacy of the Harrowfield family no longer binds you. The debts that have haunted your ancestors, the fear, the obsession, it ends with you. You now have the chance to build a future free of the shadows that once defined this place." Watson, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward, his voice filled with empathy. "It will not be easy, Reginald. The road ahead will be full of challenges, but you've already made the hardest decision. You've broken free from the past." Reginald nodded slowly, his eyes now filled with a mixture of sorrow and relief. "I know," he said quietly, "and yet I can't shake the feeling that the legacy will never truly be gone, that I'll always carry the weight of what my family did." Holmes's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, placing a hand on Reginald's shoulder. "That is the curse of any legacy, Reginald, but it is also the gift. You now have the opportunity to rewrite your story, to build something new. It will take time, yes, but you will no longer be a prisoner to your family's past." For a moment, there was only the sound of the fires crackling, the warmth of the hearth casting soft shadows across the room. Reginald's gaze drifted toward the mantel, where the now silent clock sat, a symbol of the time that had ruled his life, a time that no longer had power over him. The clock had struck its final hour, and with it, the legacy of the Harrowfield family had come to an end. But for Reginald, there was still a long road ahead. The choices he had made had freed him, but the weight of his past would follow him, shaping the decisions he made in the future. Holmes, as if reading Reginald's thoughts, spoke again. "You must not fear what comes next. The past will always be a part of you, but it does not define who you are. You will define that yourself." Reginald looked at Holmes, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I can never repay you for what you've done, for giving me the clarity I needed, for helping me see that the 13th hour was not the end, but the beginning." Holmes smiled faintly, his expression warm. "You did all the work, Reginald. I only showed you the way. You have freed yourself from the shackles of your family's legacy, and that is something no one can take from you." Watson added softly, "You have a chance now to make a life of your own, Reginald, one that is not bound by the fear of time or inheritance." As the final pieces of the mystery fell into place and the early morning light began to filter through the drawn curtains of the manor, Holmes and Watson made their way toward the door. They had uncovered the truth, solved the mystery of Lord Alistair's death, and helped Reginald confront the shadows of his family's past. Before they left, Holmes turned to Reginald one last time, his voice steady. "Remember, Reginald, it is not the past that shapes us, but our ability to move forward from it. Do not let the 13th hour define you any longer. Go forward with purpose, with your own story to tell." Reginald nodded, his gaze now resolute. "I will, Mr. Holmes. I will." As they stepped out into the cool morning air, the weight of the case finally lifted from their shoulders. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the estate. The manor, once dark and filled with secrets now seemed to stand in quiet repose, its long history finally at peace. Holmes looked up at the sky, a faint smile on his lips. Another case closed, Watson. But it is not just about solving mysteries. It is about finding the truth and helping others to find theirs. Watson nodded in agreement, but his eyes were still on Reginald, who stood at the window, watching them as they left. It's a strange thing, Holmes, how the past can haunt us for so long. But sometimes it takes a single moment to set us free. Holmes chuckled softly. Indeed, Watson, the truth has a way of setting us free, even when we least expect it. And with that, they walked away from Harrowfield Manor, leaving behind a legacy of shadows and stepping into a new dawn. A dawn where the past no longer held power over them, and where the future was theirs to shape. The end.